Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on one of the most stressful, pervasive, and politically, well, paralyzing topics in modern economics,
Yeah.
the housing crisis.
Hmm.
Specifically, we're not just focusing on whether we should build more, I think we all generally agree on that, but rather why the entire system feels so locked in this complete anxiety-fueled standoff.
And that feeling of being perpetually stuck is really the central insight of the source material we analyzed for you.
Right.
So our mission today is pretty critical.
Hmm.
Instead of looking for one gigantic, magical policy solution,
Yeah.
we're going to examine the deep systemic fears and the subtle economic nudges that keep the status quo just rigidly in place.
So the goal is to find new starting points.
Exactly. New starting points for reform that focus first on building confidence and reducing risk, rather than just forcing unwilling actors into immediate painful action.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully because the sources, they dismiss the idea that this is some sudden crisis.
That's not.
The mess we are in, the lack of supply, the crushing prices, it didn't happen because of one catastrophic decision. It's the result of lots of small choices.
That's the phrase, yeah. Lots of small choices that just kept pulling the system toward inertia.
So if the problem accumulated incrementally, then maybe the solution is also incremental. I mean, we're tracking this core idea that we need to find ways of gradually loosening things up.
Exactly right. It completely reframes the challenge. If you approach it as a political war, you look for a single winning battle. But if you approach it as a system that's just stuck in equilibrium, you look for the precise pressure points you need to shift that equilibrium, maybe one gentle nudge at a time.
Which brings us to the first common and often cynical assumption we run into, that the housing standoff is purely down to, political corruption or just a fundamental lack of will.
Or the decision makers are just slow.
Right, that they're just moving too slowly. But the sources we looked at really challenged that diagnosis.
What's so fascinating here is the root cause they identified when stakeholders speak honestly. The core issue isn't simply slowness or bad intent. It is overwhelmingly fear.
Fear.
Just fear. Think about all the stakeholders. Homeowners, local politicians, developers, future residents. When you look closely, everyone is terrified of a specific outcome.
Okay, so walk us through those specific anxieties. What are people most afraid of beyond just the high costs?
Well, there are three critical fears identified. First, and this is the big one, the fear of prices falling.
Of course.
For millions of people, their home equity is their primary non-liquid savings account. It's their retirement plan. So any policy that seriously threatens that value causes this immediate visceral pushback.
And that makes politicians terrified.
Politically terrified of enabling new supply that might crash the market.
That's completely understandable. I mean, if half your net worth is tied up in your home, you don't want a new zoning rule next door cutting that value by 20%.
Precisely. And the second fear is the fear of being blamed. Local officials know that if they push through a major development and it fails, say the traffic gets worse or the infrastructure cracks under the pressure, they personally will face the consequences.
Whereas doing nothing.
Doing nothing, while maybe it's detrimental in the long run, is politically much, much safer in the short term.
And the third fear.
That's the fear of being the one left holding the loss. This is the one for developers and early movers. The fear that an economic wobble hits right in the middle of construction.
So if the system is stalled, not because we don't have the right policies, but because of this paralyzing failure of nerve, and it's fueled by a pretty justifiable anxiety about financial ruin or political fallout, then the whole approach has to shift.
Absolutely. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the entire framework for reform changes. Instead of constantly asking, how do we force these decisions to happen and punish those who wait?
Right.
The better, more effective, and frankly more practical starting point is how do we structurally make people, homeowners, politicians, developers, more confident, or at least less afraid?
I find that so insightful because it makes perfect sense of the inaction. The political default is always to maintain the status quo.
Always.
Because the penalty for a bold move is potentially catastrophic, but the penalty for doing nothing is just time passing. Which means we have to dive into the incentives. Why does waiting feel so sensible right now?
Because the simple truth is that waiting often pays. The current system structurally rewards it.
How so?
Well, think about the fundamental mechanics of land and scarcity. When supply is capped, which is the default in so many desirable areas, that scarcity naturally props up prices. Land tends to be a fantastic hedge against inflation, and its value reliably rises over time.
So if I own a piece of land that's zoned for single-family homes, but I know the local council will eventually have to upzone it
The rational thing to do is just sit on it.
and wait for my price to multiply.
Exactly. Right. For those already in the system, whether they are homeowners benefiting from the appreciation or land speculators with deep pockets, doing nothing doesn't usually hurt them. They benefit from that underlying appreciation caused by scarcity.
So in that environment, sitting tight isn't seen as greedy or obstructive?
No, it feels entirely sensible, even responsible, especially when you compare it to the risk of sinking a bunch of capital into a development that might face years of litigation or an unexpected market correction.
Which forces this awkward but essential question. If waiting is continually rewarded and the system offers you a better return for doing nothing than for taking on the risk of development, why would any rational actor make a move?
And it's so important to clarify, like you said, this isn't about blaming individuals.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing the quiet, powerful incentives the system itself encourages. That recognition is the core diagnosis. The incentives are backwards. So the only way to unlock movement is to change the calculus so that waiting is no longer the path of least resistance.
Okay, so that leads us directly to the practical solution proposed in the sources.
Yes, shifting the incentive structure by asking, what happens if doing nothing stops being free?
This is where we need to move past the abstract policy language, because when people hear shifting incentives, they often assume it means heavy-handed punitive taxes.
Angry mandates.
Yeah,
right?
angry mandates designed to punish perceived enemies. What does the practical, non-punitive nudge actually look like here?
The sources insist the approach has to be practical, not punitive or ideological. The goal is just to introduce enough friction so that waiting no longer feels like the safest or most sensible financial choice.
So you're making the cost of inaction reflect the social cost of that continued scarcity.
That's the idea, yes.
So let's get specific. What are the mechanisms for that friction?
One key mechanism is adjusting how we treat land that's been granted planning permission but just sits there. Valid. What if holding land that is already approved for housing wasn't completely costless? For example, you could implement tiered property tax adjustments, where the tax rate slowly increases the longer that approved service land sits unused.
Or a use it or lose it approach.
A version of that, yeah. Linking the validity of planning permits to aggressive construction timelines. But you'd structure it with long ramp-up so it doesn't penalize genuine building efforts, only long-term speculative hoarding.
I see. So it doesn't penalize someone for just owning land, but it penalizes the decision to withhold housing units from the market indefinitely once they have the governmental green light to proceed.
Exactly.
It's just a nude away from permanent pause, giving developers a reason to build sooner rather than later.
You're just changing the cost-benefit analysis at the margin. If sitting on land earns you 10% appreciation a year, but now your carrying costs are suddenly 2% higher, that 8% net return looks far less attractive than sinking the capital into a project that yields a modest return and gets built quickly.
You change the calculus without having to smash the entire market.
Exactly.
That brings us to another huge structural issue, which is the role housing plays in our collective financial lives. We have to address this provocative question the source material poses. Do all homes really need to behave like speculative investments?
That's such a crucial question because right now, we are demanding the impossible from our housing stock.
What do you mean?
We treat housing as a single asset type that must serve multiple, often conflicting roles all at once. It has to be a safe, comfortable place to live,
Okay.
a reliable store of wealth, a substitute for a pension plan, and a speculative opportunity where prices must continually rise.
And when you try to satisfy all of those demands at the same time, the one that inevitably wins is the financial one, the requirement for price appreciation.
Correct. The issue arises when the main sign of success for both governments and homeowners is treated as just rising prices.
And when that happens?
Everything else gets squeezed out. Affordability, quick construction, stable communities, access for new buyers. It creates this negative feedback loop.
So the shift isn't about demanding that existing homeowners sacrifice their equity overnight. I mean, that's politically impossible.
And socially cruel.
And socially cruel, right. The shift is about asking, can we structurally build some proportion of housing where speculation just isn't the point?
Precisely. The objective is not to ban speculation entirely in the general market, But to create enough supply in non-speculative forms like permanently affordable housing or community land trusts or models with deed restrictions that cap resale appreciation so that the price fever breaks.
You want to take the edge off.
Just take the edge off the speculation and calm things down for everyone. If housing is no longer guaranteed to be the best and safest speculative asset, then maybe capital flows elsewhere and the housing system can relax a little.
Now, when we talk about large-scale, non-speculative construction or major reform, the conversation immediately turns to the government. And the common fear is that the state now has to take on everything.
Right, that it has to be the builder, the landlord, the infrastructure provider, all at once.
But the sources offer a reality check on that.
They do. The answer to whether the state needs to do everything itself is definitively no.
And that makes sense. I mean, we don't expect the government to build every road, but we do expect it to set the rules and, absorb the initial risk of building a power grid or a major new subway line.
That's the perfect analogy.
So what is the essential targeted role of the state in breaking this housing standoff?
The state's role is defined not by mass production, but by risk mitigation and pathfinding. What the state has to do is take on early risk, set direction, and crucially, make it safer for others to follow.
So the state's intervention should be targeted precisely at those areas where fear and uncertainty are causing private capital to just freeze up.
It's exactly right. Think about basic research in emerging tech, like the early internet or advanced battery storage. The government often steps in to fund the initial, highly uncertain proof-of-concept stages.
Absorbing the millions of dollars of potential failure.
Yes, so that when the technology is proven viable, private companies can safely step in and scale it up. The state absorbs the initial uncertainty and the blame if it wobbles, allowing the rest of the market to move from a position of confidence, not fear.
Okay, so applying that back to housing, what does that concrete action of going first, of taking the risk, actually look like on the ground?
It means practical steps designed to lower market tension. It could involve the state, or maybe a municipal land agency building directly in a few key complex places to prove the viability of new building types, or to show that the infrastructure capacity is real.
So, for instance, the state might secure and service the first 100 acres of an upzoned area.
And prove that the sewage lines, the schools, the traffic management plans, that they actually work.
So the government isn't building the whole city, it's just de-risking the first 100 units so that private developers don't have to hire expensive consultants for 3 years just to prove the concept is structurally feasible.
Exactly. And it also means actively absorbing some of the political blame if things wobble slightly. By intervening and taking on that initial political and financial risk, the government is essentially putting up a shield.
Which lowers the tension.
It lowers the tension across the entire sector. And when the tension is lower, developers and local politicians can relax enough to actually move forward.
So if we look back at everything we've just unpacked, we've had a really fundamental shift in perspective. The conversation has moved entirely away from the unproductive debates about whether people are inherently greedy or markets are inherently evil.
Which is where these discussions typically stall out, yeah.
The focus is much simpler, it's more technical, and way more actionable.
It is. Can we structurally make building feel safer? Can we aud homes without financially wiping out existing residents or developers? And crucially, can we unlock movement by adjusting incentives and addressing institutional risk directly without needing everyone to be extraordinarily brave all at once?
And if the answer to those questions is yes, which the evidence suggests it must be if we adjust those levers, that's precisely where we have a viable roadmap to start. It's a strategy built on confidence and stability and risk management, not on political confrontation.
The synthesis is just so clear. The housing standoff is a function of paralyzed risk management, not a scarcity of policy ideas. Movement is absolutely possible if we treat it as a solvable systemic challenge.
So we've covered the paralyzing power of fear, the systemic reward for waiting, how to introduce a practical nudge to make inaction costly, the investment trap that housing has become, and the essential role of the state as a risk buffer.
And that leads us to a final, provocative thought for you to consider, tying this back to how we manage risk generally. We deal with profound uncertainty in other vital parts of our economy. Utilities, transport networks, large-scale energy projects, by having strong institutions go first and absorb the initial wobbles and regulatory uncertainties.
Right.
Why then is the housing discussion so often framed as needing this collective universal bravery where every citizen must immediately agree to accept massive, immediate personal financial risk? when a familiar institutional risk mitigation approach might be all that is actually required to unlock the stable movement we need.
Again, something to mull over until our next deep dive.